So let's get started. Welcome today to SEVA VentRounds, July 27, 2021. And we named this one Too Tough to Trigger. And I think that you'll get the message of this type of desynchronies as we go through. So a couple of disclosures that we have to do is the first one is we discuss particulars of ventilator modes, and there's no endorsement of any particular mode, manufacturer, or company. We really don't care about any of them. We want people to interact and learn more about how the ventilators react to our patients. Whatever we say, Rob and I, is our opinion. It does not represent the Cleveland Clinic. And here are disclosures for myself and for Rob Chatburn. In some ground rules, all these sessions are recorded, so keep your microphone muted. The moderator may call upon members of the audience to comment, and if you want to comment, use the chat function of WebEx. Now, I will tell you something. Today we are transmitting from downtown Cleveland from the public library, and so I'm using a single screen. Normally I have two screens, so the chat function, I may be a little bit delayed. I'll be taking a look here and there, but be aware. There's also going to be a WebEx poll for each one of our cases that if you have the ability to use it, I would ask you to use it because it's a way to learn more, to go through the method, to test yourself. All of the answers are anonymous. There's no fireback of any kind, and I don't know essentially who's answering what. The Cleveland Clinic employees get CMEs, and there's a QR code at the end of the session that can help you claim those. So we're going to start with this is the beginning of the year, so July is a good time for us because all our new fellows come to the clinic, and so we put here a series of images, a couple of them, before we go to the meat of two of the submissions that occurred for us to review here at SEVA VentRounds. So just for explanation to everybody, we have a method that consists of three basic steps. The first one is what is the tag, which essentially talks about what is the taxonomic attribution group, or what the mode does, because volume control may not be actually volume control. This is a commercial name, a manufacturer name. And so we have to use a tag for this to know exactly what the mode does, what controls the breath, what's the breath sequence, and what's the targeting scheme. And this will become self-evident with time. The next step that we do is what is the load. And from just looking at the waveforms, we can say if the elastance is high or low, the resistance is high or low, or if there's evidence of effort from the patient. And then if there's patient activity, what is the patient ventilator discordance? And we go in order from trigger, inspiration, cycle, and expiration, and we analyze what's happening in each one of these phases. So having said that, I would ask if there's any of our fellows that is interested on telling us what is the tag and what is the load for this mode. And I'm going to stay quiet for a second and waiting for any of our fellows to jump in. And if not, in 3 seconds, I will start reading it up myself. Anybody that wants to read it?
Can take a stab at it, Dr. Mireles.
Okay, thank you, Ahmed. Go ahead.
All right, so this is VC CMVS, and this is I can tell by looking at the flow waveform how controlled it is, and the fact that there is a constant flow. And then CMV, because it seems like all the breaths are mandatory in the sense of they are fully controlled by the machine here, being machine triggered and machine cycle. And then in terms of the load, I would say this is an elastic load, kind of looking at the proportion. I look at the pressure waveform and looking at the proportion of the resistive and elastic component, and the steepness of the slope of the line at the top tells you that this is more of an elastic load, is what I'm thinking.
Excellent. Gohar, thank you for this very nice analysis. Is there any patient ventilator discordance that you can see here?
Really, and I think, I mean, it would be, it's basically, I would say, not applicable because I don't see any patient efforts. So there's no discord.
Excellent. So if there's no patient, there cannot be discordance. Although there may be some false triggering, but in this case, there's nothing that signals towards that. So that's correct. So just by looking at this, you just analyze this waveform. Rob, any comments that you have or questions for Ahmed? Great job, Ahmed.
You might point out at this point, how did you know that there's no patient triggering happening?
Ahmed?
Yeah, there's no, I don't see any patient effort, correct? I don't see any patient trigger effort. There's no significant dips in the pressure waveform, or I don't see any flips that would indicate a flow trigger. So kind of this is how I'm identifying the presence or absence of triggering. Now, machines make things easy for us, and on this specific ventilator, it can color code, which there's no change in color here as well, either indicating that there is no patient trigger.
Outstanding. So just highlighting, and Ahmed, this one came with an extra point. So you'll see in a second. So I will point out. So this is the breath control variable. So the volume control is what we're controlling, and Ahmed was very careful on saying we're controlling the flow. Notice how the flow is constant through the breath. That means that we're controlling the flow, and the pressure is going to be dependent on either the presence of the patient effort or the resistance or the elastance is what we're going to see on this pressure waveform. The next one is the breath sequence. And what the breath sequence talks about is the presence of the two types of breaths, either spontaneous breaths or mandatory breaths. And what this mandatory breath is one in which either the trigger and the cycle are controlled by the machine, by the ventilator, not dependent on the patient characteristics or the patient effort. And so that gives you three different sequences. One sequence is in which all the breaths are mandatory, which Ahmed recognized, at least in those two are mandatory. So this is a mandatory all CMB. The sequence in which all the breaths are spontaneous. So they start and end by the patient signal, either PMOS or the last answer resistance. And the last one is IMB, in which there's a combination of mandatory and spontaneous breath within them. And the last one is targeting, the targeting scheme, which is the software, the way that we control the computer. And S stands for set point, meaning the most basic type of control that we have on a ventilator. You set the amount of flow, the amount of time, the rate, those all the size of the breath. You set everything. So that's what we call set point. Rob, any comments about this?
No, that's pretty straightforward.
Excellent. I see a comment. I saw a comment floating in. They said, technically, we are controlling the inspiratory flow, but should we differentiate it from controlling the volume when we say that only pressure or volume could be controlled? Rob, you want to give a little bit of background there?
Yeah, strictly speaking, most modern ventilators have proportional flow control valves. So it is a fact that in volume control, they're controlling the flow waveform. However, historically, the first ventilators were mostly piston driven. So we would call that volume control because you're directly controlling the size of the tidal volume by controlling the displacement of a piston in a cylinder. But for historic reasons, It's just easier to talk about pressure control versus volume control. I think mostly because those early ventilators were actually controlling the volume of a piston delivered to a patient. I think engineers would agree with you that it's really just pressure control and flow control, but mathematically, if you control flow directly, then you're indirectly controlling volume and vice versa, because they're indirect functions. So there's no real utility in distinguishing flow control from volume control for the purposes of classifying modes. So we just stuck a stake in the sand and said, we're going to call volume control or pressure control. And just then to put some detail on that, volume control means that the operator sets both the tidal volume and the flow, either the peak flow and or the flow waveform. If you can't set both of those things, it's not volume control. And pressure control, of course, is when you're setting the parameters of the pressure waveform.
Thank you, Rob. That's fabulous. The next item that Ahmed Gohar talked about was the load, and meaning the elastance, resistance, and PMOS. And as we advanced on the course, the SEVA course, and through the year, you're gonna start, the equation of motion will become part of your life. To the point that one of our fellows temporarily tattooed that into her arm for graduation. It was pretty funny. But essentially, how it goes is the pressure by the muscles, by the patient, plus the pressure by the ventilator equal the amount of the elastance or elastic load, which is elastance times volume, and plus resistance times flow. These two together, when you multiply them, give you a pressure, which we call the elastic load. And when you multiply these two, gives you a pressure that we call the resistive load, or units of pressure. And so you can see that the pressure that you use with the ventilator, or breathing on your own, or breathing with the ventilator, has to equal the load generated by the elastic load and the resistive load together. This is a simplified version, but I think that for all the purposes that we do, it's the easiest way to know it. And so when the patient is passive, just like in this case, there is no patient activity, you can see that the elastic load, which actually is seen down here, it's this triangle over here, is all this area, is the volume that we're giving to the patient. When you multiply it by the elastance, gives you this triangle that you see up here, like that, is exactly the same shape. And then the resistive load is this flow times resistance, which is this area over here. And you can see that area over here. So what Ahmed did appropriately is recognize that this space between PEEP to this change in the slope is actually given this little step up by the resistive load, and then the slope is given by the elastic load. And because the change in pressure that occurred through all this and the slope, he thought the main cause for this was elastic, which is correct. In this case, it's a normal individual, and the majority of the load is in the elastic load. And so that's what he was talking about. When there's PMOS, you see the formations of the waveform. Alrighty. So Rob put a very nice definition there about the load is a force or pressure, and which is what we're talking about. Thank you, Rob, for putting it out there. Alrighty. So Ahmed, if you want to give a stab on this, it's the same patient, but something changed. You want to go at it?
Yeah, I think the main change here, I would say, is maybe evidence of first patient triggering. As you can see, the depth in the pressure waveform, although I think this is a flow triggered breath given the changing color of the flow waveform as well. And then the evidence of PMOS throughout the inspiration, which again, we're controlling the flow, so I don't expect to see any changes in the flow, but when you look at the pressure waveform, we can see the scooping, and instead of the triangle that you were pointing to earlier. And if you are to draw that imaginary triangle again, then all the difference is basically the evidence of PMOS.
Excellent. What about expiration? Expiration. Do you see any activity, any PMOS during exhalation?
No, the exhalation is mainly passive here. So you can see a very nice decelerating flow with no evidence of PMOS. There is no, like, it's not pulled downward, indicating more expiratory flow. So this is all passive.
Fantastic. And so that's how you can see that this is using the time constant. And we'll go into more detail, but in this time, it's more consistent with that elastic load. And in terms of PV discordance, any comments about the trigger? Normal, early, late, false, failed? Any concerns here?
I think I would say it's normal. The trigger looks normal, and then again, kind of some work shifting and inspiration. And then in terms of cycling, I think there is the cycling is spot on. There is no evidence of early or late cycling.
Okay. Fantastic, Ahmed. So now you can see there's presence of patient effort, and we can recognize the patient effort, but it's only during inspiration. So it's a patient-triggered breath, but is cycled by the machine when the tidal volume, the flow, and the inspiratory time has elapsed. It turns it off, and that even though it's patient-triggered, it's cycled by the machine. It's mandatory. And that makes it a mandatory breath. So even though these are patient-triggered, they are machine cycled, so it becomes a mandatory breath. This is a common source of confusion in our caregivers at times, that they think that this is a spontaneous breath because it's triggered by the patient, which is not the case. Rob, any comments?
Yes, the circles that you have drawn indicate or reflect the deformations of the flow and pressure waveform during the trigger phase. In this case, we see that there's a white vertical line on the green flow line indicating that this is a flow trigger. And you will notice, if you look very closely, that flow goes from 0 up to some tiny little flow before it turns into the white vertical line. The distance that that flow has to go up is the sensitivity setting. So the lower the sensitivity, the higher the flow trigger threshold, and the more that flow curve will be deformed in a positive direction before you get the trigger event. So that's why, because there's a very short flow rise time here, we can say that this was adequate normal triggering. If it took a long time for the trigger event to happen after the start of the positive rise in the flow, then we could say that that would probably be the delayed trigger, probably in this case due to a poor sensitivity setting, with the flow trigger threshold being too high. What's too high? Probably more than 3 liters a minute. 1 to 3 is probably what you see average.
Yep. Fabulous. All righty. Ahmed, as usual, really good readings. I'm gonna look at the chat for a second just to be sure that we don't have any questions from the audience.
So far, so good. I'm watching it.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Okay, I'll close it here. So we're gonna move on, and I'm gonna so this helps you put things into context of what we're gonna see next, which is a very cool waveform submitted by our friends in Argentina, Jose Martin Núñez Silveira, who sent us this case, clinical case, and he asked the people, I saw this overnight, and it's a night of desynchronies. So I'm gonna put the poll up, and I want to see how people, if I can get it on. If I cannot get the poll up, don't worry about it. Okay, I cannot put the poll. So what I would ask you to do is, for a second, try to go in your mind on what is the tag, all right? What is the load? And what patient ventilator discordance do you see here? Now, there's several breaths. So sometimes you will say there's several discordances, and that's okay. That's okay to have several. Now, this is one of the screenshots that I had. There's another one, but we're gonna start with this one, which I thought would make even more sense with the next waveform that we're gonna have. And so I'm gonna give you a couple of seconds to think about it. If there's any fellow that wants to get a stab at it, I know it looks horrendous, but chillax, we'll walk you through it.
I can try this, Dr. Mireles, UD here.
Okay, before you start, look at the screen, take a deep breath. Are you ready to go?
Sure, I can try.
Okay, let's walk it together, okay?
Okay.
Go for it. So what is your tag for this mode?
So I think my tag is VCCMVS. The reason I'm seeing this is that I think the inspiratory flow is pretty, it seems like machine made. And yeah, and I think in the bottom one, I'm cheating a little bit, but I think there's a tidal volume set, although it's in Spanish. Then going through the systematically, and I'm going to try to, I think probably going to see the middle breath. That'll perhaps help me a little bit. Load wise, I think it's, I think there's a lot of PMAS is the main thing. In terms of inspiratory load, especially on the third breath, we always look at the non-control variable to look for any load and PMAS. So I think there's deformities in the third breath, that is PMAS. In the second breath, I think there's a nice curve. I think it's probably a little bit of PMAS there, but I could be wrong. In expiration, the usually you know, the load, if it's elastic or resistive in inspiration, is also the same in expiration. But here in expiration, you see a lot of PMAS here, with a bunch of stuff going on in expiratory limb, especially in the second breath. In terms of PV discordance, if I were to see trigger, so what I'm seeing is that it seems that all of these are actually machine triggered breaths. The patient trigger, I would not say that. I would say probably that the trigger is normal. Let me just think about it a little bit. The third breath, I think there's some PMAS in the inspiratory limb. I'm wondering if this is a case of an early trigger, because you see that hump, and then there is positive flow even in the expiration. So there's a phase difference between neural inspiratory time and the ventilator inspiratory time. Then going to the next PV discount in terms of inspiration, as you can see on the third breath, there is work shifting, because the patient is shifting a little bit of work and doing a bit of work by himself, and that's how we define work shifting. Cycle. So in terms of cycle, I think that you can call it early cycle, but I think basically the operator had set a certain inspiratory time, and maybe the patient effort is just lagging by a little bit. So I don't know whether this, I would not, I would call it actually normal cycle here, because it's not, because the cycle is early to the patient effort. I think it's just a phase difference. In expiration, I think there is expiratory work shifting, and especially in the second breath. Just going back, I wonder if there is also a failed trigger between second and the third breaths, where the flow reaches the baseline and is a failed trigger.
Very good. Udi, great job. Great thought process. In terms of the tag, I think that you're spot on. I actually intentionally cut it off. You do remember that when it says the tidal volume here, it could be PRVC, but that is not the case. Your flow is controlled breath to breath. And this is one of the features of this ventilator, that you can set the termination point for the flow. So in many ventilators, in the ramp, when you put a ramp, you finish all the way down here. But in this ventilator, you can put a % of the peak where you ended. Why? What is the benefit of that? I have no idea. Why would they put that? I think that that's one of those things that you probably don't need as a feature on your ventilator, but it exists. Or maybe somebody in the universe can explain to us what is the benefit of having it, and we're happy to learn from it. Alrighty. The next item is the CMB. As you pointed out, all of them are mandatory because they finish where it's at set I time. So this is mandatory end, and these are mandatory starting mandatory. So that means that these all are mandatory breaths, and set point is appropriate targeting scheme for these type of breaths that we are seeing here. The patient ventilator discordance, I think that you are correct. This is an early trigger. There's a mandatory breath followed by PMOS. And when there's a mandatory breath followed by PMOS, this is early trigger. One of the causes of early trigger is called reverse trigger, which is what you will find in the literature. But this only describes that pattern in which it's out of phase. There's the machine triggered, and then the patient followed up to suit. There is also a couple of failed triggers. I would say it's not only this one. Udi, I think that this one right here is a failed trigger, and this one over here is another failed trigger. And we know that because the flow is above the baseline, but there's an artifact here of sorts. But look how the pressure drops below the baseline. I mean, massively. It drops all the way from here to here, and there's not a trigger from the patient. And the same occurred here. It went from this level to this level, and there's a failed trigger. So there's an early, but there's also a failed. So this patient essentially is locked out from the ventilator. He's breathing against, he's trying to trigger, he can't. And the ventilator is just simply not giving him breaths when he wants. You are right that there is work shifting here. These ones don't have work, and I would say that when we talk about load, in these two breaths, you can actually talk a little bit about the load. Notice the difference in height. Sorry for returning to that, but I just have to say it. Notice the difference in height between this peak and this peak. They look pretty passive for a descending ramp, but they end up all the one higher than the other. And the reason why they end higher than the other is that this patient got a breath. He was still doing effort to breathe in. Then he exhaled very little. He doesn't get to exhale everything. And he gets another breath on top of it, which essentially it's over distending the lungs. So you see more elastic load. And then in the next one, when the patient does an effort to inhale, he deforms the waveform down. So that's where the work shifting came from. In terms of the cycle, I would tend to agree with you that the only breath that I can see that there is a evidence of PMOS during the breath is this one. And usually when you have early trigger, this will be compounded with the presence of early cycle, which is what happened over here. And finally, there's evidence of expiratory work. This seems to be some work there. This looks very passive, and I mean, the patient is doing work throughout the breath. So if I would say something about this, is I think that you are absolutely correct about the failed, the early, the work shifting, and all of this is probably because the pressure trigger or the flow trigger, but probably it's the pressure trigger very, very low. And you'll see in the next one, because that helps us read it a little bit, or actually very high. So you have to reach very high pressures to achieve it. So Roberto, I know that this probably you're fascinated by this. So what are your thoughts here?
Well, just looking at the flow waveform, it looks like we have the very first thing we see, it might be a little mistrigger. But the thing that stands out to me most of all is these two periods on the first and the last breath of zero flow, looking like an expiratory hold.
Yeah.
And they have different times, so it almost looks like a mandatory inspiratory hold, because there's no inspiratory hold on the middle breath. So if that was a setting, like a set inspiratory hold time, that would happen on every breath. So this is a bit of a mystery here.
Yeah, I think I'm going to put the next waveform because I think that helps us a little bit. So here you have, it's the same one, same patient, just a little bit later. And you have that passive breath. We agree that this is passive.
Mm.
And this one looks like a passive breath too. Again, it looks like the load is mainly elastic. Sorry, I keep writing over my cable. Elastic, and it returns relatively rapidly down. So I would say this is elastic too. So, and it's the same mode. But look at this, the trigger here. This is we have two triggers in which we see that it's a pressure trigger and it changes color. It goes from a PEEP of 10 all the way to baseline or even lower than baseline. And then it triggers the breath. You see that?
Yep.
And so I think that in the sake of trying to control this individual, they set the trigger threshold really high, and it was unable to trigger during those periods of time. So he triggered here, then he got the breath, but his effort had ended, and then he has this, or he keeps doing effort, and then he has this pause that caught my attention. I mean, why would the ventilator have a end inspiratory pause? And it's, I mean, it could be the refractory period, but it looks too long to be the same, right? So I think that that's what was left, unless there was a misfunction with the ventilator of sorts. But that's what it seems to be, that they set the threshold very low. I don't know if Manuel Núñez Silveira is on the line and he wants to comment on what was happening.
Hello. I'm
Hey,
sorry for my English is not very good. Thank you for the invitation, Eduardo.
no problem. And if you have
Uh,
anything that you want to say in Spanish, you can say it. I'll translate. It's but you're amongst friends, Juan Martin. So go ahead.
okay. In this image, we can see the trigger is pressure, and we have a problem with the programmation of the trigger. We don't know who, no sabemos quién fue. Pero hubo una programación extrema del trigger por presión y por eso vemos esos esfuerzos donde el paciente hace un gran esfuerzo, que es en el primer ciclo donde hay un flujo cero y vemos la gran caída de la presión sin que el ventilador pueda iniciar el ciclo. Y lo vemos en el último ciclo también donde Robert marca la caída de la presión al final del ciclo. Creo que ahí inicia un ciclo el paciente que después se ve con la amputación del pico flujo expiratorio y después la consiguiente caída de la presión que no desencadena un nuevo ciclo.
So what Juan Martin was describing is that without a doubt, somebody did the setting on the ventilator with that pressure that was pretty low, and so he's describing what we're seeing, which is the dips in pressure with later the triggering of the breath, as we described. So this was without a doubt a issue with a trigger setting, and actually you are absolutely right. I saw a little message from Miguel Ibarra talking about this effort here, and this event here is what we would call a late trigger. This is a perfect example of a late trigger in which the patient, because of a setting that was set inappropriately, has to do a major amount of effort, and there's a prolonged delay from the beginning of the effort to the moment where the patient is able to finally trigger. And you can actually see it also, let me see if I can amplify this, in the flow waveform, how it crosses the baseline. So the flow is above the baseline, but it's not triggering a breath because the patient is unable to reach that level. Go ahead, Rob, comments?
I'm still not understanding what's causing that inspiratory hold. We got a little period of zero flow and volume is held as you look at the volume control. I mean, the volume waveform.
Yeah.
Patient's still making an effort because the pressure drops down even below baseline. But what's causing the inspiratory hold on that breath and not on the breath before and after?
Yeah, that's I kept looking at it because if you see here, the flow actually does not improve. I mean, it stays static, right?
Yeah, the
Like
volume
if
is static, but the flow is zero. So that means the airway is occluded.
it's occluded and the patient is doing actually is dropping the pressure below
Yeah,
the
patient's
baseline,
trying to suck in. Yeah. So
right?
what's causing that occlusion? If it's not
And
a
that's
manual inspiratory hold maneuver, what is it?
there has to be.
Sorry,
Yeah, go ahead, Juan Manuel. Were you guys trying to do this on your own?
yes. Lo que pienso que el volumen sostenido, que es lo que explica Robert,
Rob?
tiene que ver con que la válvula expiratoria está ocluida porque el trigger es muy alto y el paciente es como que sigue sosteniendo el volumen dentro del pulmón, ¿no? Es como que no termina de exhalar porque el paciente sigue inspirando.
Yeah. So
Que
Rob,
vemos en la
what
caída de
he's
la
saying.
fase, en la... Okay, I'm sorry.
No. What he's translating, I'm translating, Rob,
Mhm.
is that because the setting on the of the pressure trigger was so high, then the patient is trying to generate the negative pressure, but because the setting on the trigger is so high, it doesn't allow him to get the flow so that he can trigger the ventilator. Because if the ventilator allowed him to suck to generate negative, it kept the pressure constant, then you would not be able to generate a negative pressure. So the ventilator, in order to achieve that, has to close the valve. Does that make sense?
Yeah. In order to have pressure control, you can't allow the flow to be fed when the patient breathes in. It has to
Exactly.
drop the pressure. Yeah. That makes
So
sense. That makes sense. Yeah.
Actually, what this generates, and I had not ever thought about this, and so Juan Martin is explaining this very well. Is actually the expiratory phase that we always said that the expiratory phase is PEEP control is at this point being flow controlled.
It's not. Yeah.
It's a flow control.
It's uncontrolled. Right. Exactly right.
Right.
Yeah. That's a very good detail that we need to add to our taxonomy here. It's completely uncontrolled. It's basically occluded for a period of time.
So normally the point that we're making, just to summarize and put it under context, is that during the expiratory phase, so from here to here, all this period of time, in normal circumstances, when you're flow triggering, it's a pressure control breath. So if there's no effort, the patient essentially decays from the pressure that you were, and you're going to have this exponential decay, and that allows us to read the waveform. However, in this circumstance, because they set the trigger as a pressure controller, a pressure trigger, the machine has to occlude the valve in order to generate the negative pressure, so that that generates the effort from the patient, or it can read the threshold, and that makes it not pressure control, as we always have said that this is a pressure control phase. It actually makes it a flow control phase, which is a new paradigm in our taxonomy.
Well, if you're saying that it's zero
Partially.
flow, it's controlled at zero flow, I suppose you could say that.
Otherwise, how do you call it?
Yeah, that's a good
I don't know.
question. I have to think that through, but it's not a good thing, obviously, because that large pressure drop is work that the patient's having to do, and certainly it can't be comfortable.
It can't be comfortable. So this is a sad phase, right? It's working hard. Wonderful. Outstanding questions from the audience. Let me see the chat. All right, I see that you answered some of those questions, right, Rob?
Yeah, I'm trying to keep up on it.
Is that a delay trigger at the second and fourth breath? Yes, so we answered that. How do we know how much time between PMOS and machine trigger is too much? That's a great question. Miguel, in general, this is a study by Catherine Sassoon in respiratory care in 2011. She evaluated a bunch of ventilators, and old and new, and the majority were under 60 milliseconds. However, the oldest, the worst performance was around 100 milliseconds. So we say anything above 100 milliseconds, but that's a number that obviously needs more research to figure out where does delayed become significant, right? It's not just the timing, it's also the effort that the patient have and how much the deep and the pressure time product generated from that. But in general, simple terms, I would say that anything above 100 milliseconds. Rob?
Well, just from a practical point of view, when we set a ventilator up and we want the patient to be able to trigger, we adjust the trigger threshold, whether it's pressure or flow, as low as it'll go until it starts to auto trigger, and then we back it off a little bit. And that's how we fine tune to get maximum trigger sensitivity. And if the trigger sensitivity is less than that, meaning that the threshold is higher than that, then I would say that's arbitrarily too much. Why would you do that?
Right. Right. Very good. So we have a couple of minutes left. Well, not couple, 9 minutes left. And I have a gift for you. This comes from, this was one of our patients in the neuro ICU. And here it goes. I'm going to ask, is there any of our fellows that wants to read this one? And I think actually, Rob, this is exactly the same case. Now I'm seeing it with the new open eyes, as with the benefit of having the ability to read these things. So, any fellow that wants to read this one?
Can I go again?
Who's this?
Udi.
Udi, you can go as many times as you want.
Okay, I'll try. So I think the tag is pressure control CSVS.
Mm-hmm.
The load, I'm going to try to go from breath to breath. The scales. So if I'm looking at the pressure control, I'm looking at the flow waves, and I think I would say PMAS is the main load. And in expiration, I would also say PMAS. I may not be right here. Trigger-wise, seems that the spontaneous breaths are to the right of the screen based on the color coding. And when the pressure goes down, I think it is triggering. So I would say probably I'm just, there's a bit of flattened portion in the flow before the flow rises again. I'm wondering if this is a late trigger.
Okay, inspiration.
In inspiration, I think the patient, the flow is deformed. So I would say this is work shifting.
Cycle.
Cycle, I would say that the cycle is normal.
Mm-hmm.
The flow goes down pretty, especially on the right side, goes down as soon as the patient's done with the cycle. Expiration, I think there's also work shifting, expiratory work.
All right. Thank you, Udi. This is a challenging one, very challenging case. So I agree with you. I mean, you have here the name. I left it there so that you guys could read it because I thought that if I took it out, you would probably try to shoot me. So I left the pressure control. then I think that they are all spontaneous breaths. As you point out, this is the only ones that I can see actually evidence of a patient breath is this one. Is you see here it actually triggered and it cycles. It seems here, but there's no activity in between them. So I thought that CSB makes sense here. And I think it's set point because I know that you set the pressure support at 10 and you can see it for those two breaths. In terms of the load, I think I only see PMOS. I cannot define anything else except the presence of PMOS. And how do I know that there's PMOS? Is because I see the flow go down. That means that the patient is exhaling and then he's inhaling. And when he inhales, the pressure actually goes down, and then he exhales or tries to exhale a little bit, pressure goes up. He inhales, pressure goes down. He exhales, pressure goes up, and so forth. So you have evidence of this waveform. Is not the ventilator doing anything. It's actually the patient that keeps trying to take a breath, and he's unable to get the breath, to get a patient-delivered breath. And when you see the trigger, actually what you have is every single one of these that drops, even though the flow is crossing the baseline. This is actually a good learning point. There's two causes for failed trigger, and one of the causes of failed trigger is what? Anybody?
Sensitivity.
Yeah. So one is sensitivity. What's the other one?
Auto peep.
Auto peep. That's the most disturbing one. And usually in auto peep, you will not be crossing the baseline. The flow will not cross the baseline. The attempt, as it will be over here, trying to get to baseline to trigger. But in this case, it's sensitivity. They left the sensitivity so high that the patient actually can cross. And there's again this flow limitation, Rob, that we saw on the other one. And I guess it's determined by the set pressure that they put for the trigger.
Yep.
And so you have a bunch of failed because of sensitivity and late trigger, well determined here. The breath actually started here, Udi, and it took all this time for the ventilator to actually trigger, all this period of time here. That tells me that there's a late and a bunch of failed triggers. And then in a sense, there's work shifting because this patient is getting positive flow, but he's dropping the pressure below the baseline.
Well, here's the thing about that, Eduardo.
Yeah.
If we just learn that in pressure triggering under this circumstances, the ventilator is actually occluding the airway, then those horizontal lines on the flow waveform are representing zero flow. And the reason why they look above baseline, one is because look at the scale. The scale is greatly magnified. It's only 0 to 10 liters. And so that's just a scale or a calibration error. Those should be parallel to the zero flow line.
Yeah, which is probably what we see here. You can tell that
because there's no volume being delivered.
Yeah.
See, if you look down at the volume waveform, there's nothing happening. So those are zero flows. They look above zero because of a calibration error or display error.
Display error. So the flow is greatly amplified there to see the effort from the patient.
Yep. The patient's sucking and nothing's happening.
Oh my God. All right. So work shifting. There's two breaths. So actually, this is a question, Rob. Under these circumstances, that's work shifting. Although there's no inspiratory flow, there is pressure that drops below the baseline. Do we agree with that?
Yeah, and you could say it's work shifting in the sense that the trigger work is up because the patient is obviously sucking some volume out of the circuit, otherwise the pressure wouldn't drop. So that volume that he's sucking out, that little bit of volume and that big pressure, that's contributing to work to trigger.
Yeah.
And the ventilator is not helping him when it should be. So I suppose you could call that work shifting.
Yeah, I wonder if this is just the effort that the flow that they can get from the circuit as they're pulling back.
Yeah, well, that might be a baseline flow. I mean, but it's very, very low, right?
Very low, very low.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
So I think that we have two cases here in which the pressure now you can talk about pressure triggering and how the ventilator reacts to that. And what you're seeing right here is a very high threshold for that pressure, leading to a late trigger and a bunch of failed, just similar to the case that we saw before, several cases of that. So that's two cases in which a pressure trigger is set. And I presume that in both cases is because the patient was doing so much effort that they tried to lock them out from the ventilator so that they would stay within tidal volumes that were appropriate or within rates that were appropriate for the caregivers.
Which I would argue is not the appropriate response. You can't
Right.
fix this kind of problem with the ventilator. You have to fix the patient's drive.
Right, or extubate him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very, very good. Let's see what the audience is commenting so far. All righty, great job, Hara. Let's see. Does that mean we generally set Okay, that was you. All right. Thank you, Udi. You make a statement about pressure trigger always causes problems. Should we use it at all ever? I would say yes, absolutely. This is there's many settings on the ventilator, many modes on the ventilator, and they are not for everybody. But there are situations in which a pressure trigger may be the best option for the patient. Can anybody on the chat put us what their thoughts are on which patients is a pressure trigger the right way to go? Anybody? Or you can unmute and go at it. Let's see the chat.
Situations where I think to switch the trigger type, whether or not it's a specific answer now, are situations where we have a lot of false triggers with one. So if the flow trigger keeps false triggering for whatever reason, cardiac oscillations or on whatever other reason, then I would try switching it and see if it helps. That may not be the most specific answer.
No, that's a good one, Stephen. That's a really good observation. So what I would say is, in general, switching when you have cardiac oscillations, and you're auto triggering because the oscillations are X amount of size. What I do is actually I change the size of the gain on the ventilator to be able to see, and that's probably what they did here is they changed the gain, and then you set your flow trigger above the cardiac oscillation level, and that will take that away from it. So you can actually measure what's the actual cardiac oscillation flow that it generates, and you just set your trigger above that so that it's not auto triggering. But one of the alternatives is to change it to pressure. There's other situations in which you have false trigger that will cause pressure trigger may be better. Anybody? Any thoughts?
Yeah, if you have a constant leak through a chest tube or an uncuffed endotracheal tube.
Exactly. So constant flow through a hole that it's not the trachea, that it's not like the lung, the going back into the ventilator will lead to false trigger due to flow exiting the system, and that's a great etiology for that. Very good. There's a comment here that a higher pressure trigger temporarily may be a good way to evaluate the strength of the patient to trigger and to do an indirect measurement of patient. I have no experience on that, so I could not comment. Yeah, so Ariel, go at it. This is Ariel is saying that he wants to test this with a simulation to test the flow trigger and what's happening with the ventilator. So this is evidently testable on several, and I would say you should test it in not only one ventilator but several ventilators. Alrighty, so it's 2:55. I'm gonna share here the CME code for those of you that want to do that. Here's the CME code, it's 4GYNPF. And you just need to scan the CME caregiver. It will take you there. There's also the SEVA webpage, which has the link for our bi-weekly conferences, as well as the link to all the YouTube videos that we post after we do this. If you have waveforms that you want to share with us, either copy us on Twitter, that's how we get several of them, and or email us. I want to thank Juan Martin for sending us these very cool images and contributing to the SEVA rounds. I want to thank Ahmed Gohar and Udi, two of our fellows, which thank you for jumping in. These were not easy waveforms. They all come with their things, and we're learning, as you can see, throughout all of this. Rob, any comments?
Nope, these are really very instructive, and I learned something today.
Yeah, me too. So with that, see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.